You're listening to the Good Question Podcast with Richard Jacobs. Our goal is to make each of our guests exclaim, that's a good question. I don't know the answer. Because when that happens, it means you, the listener, may be inspired to learn more beyond the interview and to ask great questions yourself that lead to new insights. In this podcast, we cover historical and current anthropology, comparative religion, and history. Welcome, and let's get started.
Hello, this is Richard Jacobs with the Good Question Podcast. My guest today is Lucy Penn Kerhoulas. She's an associate professor. She deals with forest physiology. She's part of the Department of Forestry and Wildland Resources at Cal Poly in Humboldt, California. So I think it's going to be a very interesting call. Welcome, Lucy.
Thanks. I'm happy to be here.
Well, great. Tell me a bit about your background and then just some clarification on the work that you do now, because some of the terms, like, I don't know if the audience will be familiar with them, but, again, first some background.
Yeah. I grew up in Northern California, kind of near San Francisco. And I've just, even as a kid, was sort of always into nature. So I moved up to far Northern California to Humboldt County to study botany, after high school. And I kind of fell even more in love with plants while I was up here, and in particular, the really tall forests of Northern California that are here. And then I feel like it's kind of been the rest is history, sort of following the breadcrumbs where they've led me in terms of just following opportunities and ending up in grad school, studying different aspects of the natural world, and then being lucky enough to land back in Humboldt as a faculty member.
Okay. What's your work look like right now? Like, what are you studying about forest physiology and ecology?
Yeah, I have a lot of projects going on right now, or potentially too much, live and learn. But some of the studies that I've recently been really interested in are evaluating kind of forest water use has been a big theme of a lot of my research. So just better understanding how trees use water and how forests use water. And there's, really widespread human use of forests for, timber products and different restoration activities that go on. And so trying to better understand how human activities, how they influence kind of forest water use, especially in the Western U.S. where water is such a limiting resource. It's good to try to maximize water availability to forests, given all the droughts and wildfires and forest mortality. So trying to maximize that limiting resource for different forests based on human activities.
What does that mean based on human activities? Like, the Colorado River and other sources, it's because of human activity that water is sequestered from there, and there's probably a series of dams and takings and all that. I mean, can you explain more?
Yeah, definitely. So, if you go in in one study that I'm working on right now, I'll tell you a little story about the redwood forest. So Sequoia sempervirens, the coast redwood, it's the tallest tree species in the world. And it, has a really limited range naturally, kind of Northern California up into the very southern tip of Oregon, hugging the coast. And back in the heyday of logging, like in the 1800s and early 1900s, pretty much 95+% of all old growth redwood forests were logged commercially. And in the wake of that, what has regrown are kind of these dog hair thickets, these really dense forests that are way denser than the natural forests that grew here before human activity got involved. And so a big restoration effort in our region in Northern California is about thinning these dog hair thickets of young redwood forests. And by doing that, you try to reduce competition for the trees that you leave behind after the thinning, the residual trees. And in theory, they can then be like, superstars in terms of productivity once they've been released from this competition. And so some of my work is evaluating kind of how these different restoration treatments, how they might impact the water availability to the trees left behind. Does that make sense?
What do you mean the trees left behind? Oh, the ones you've cleared out essentially the underbrush and all the other junk. So, I mean, now there'll be more water access to the existing trees, right?
Yeah. In theory. So, yeah, say you go in and you remove 40% of the trees in a stand because it's super dense. And then now the 60% of the trees that are remaining, what happens to their water? availability in the soil. So in theory, you've reduced a bunch of the trees competing for the water, but you've also opened the forest up to a lot more like sunlight coming in. So in theory, their water use rates might go up, and the rate at which water is being lost to evaporation from the soil is going to go up because there's a lot more sunlight hitting the forest floor. And so there's kind of like a sweet spot of how heavily do you thin the forest so that you don't create kind of drier conditions, kind of the opposite of what you're wanting to do.
Yeah, I had heard that on certain lands, the underbrush is not being cleared, and that not only would, cause water usage problems, but also would lead to fires because it dries out. The wood and all that brush is far thinner, and therefore in dry periods, it dries out much quicker and becomes just, kindling and burns all forest. So it sounds like there's at least two reasons to cut it: water use to go to the existing large forest, and fire prevention.
Definitely. Yeah. Fuel reduction is a really big deal. So not wanting too much kind of shrub cover in the understory, which will be a lot of fuel for fires, not wanting a bunch of slash. So trying to, remove that from the site to reduce fire hazards. Yeah, so that's kind of one area of work that I've done. And then other areas looking at forest water use is trying to understand how water is shared across species within a forest. So we can use stable isotopes in water. We can think of different water sources like fog or rain or stream water or soil water or groundwater, snow, having kind of these different isotopic signatures. And then you can look at the water inside plants and try to tease out some understanding of where different plants are getting most of the water that they're using. And so it can be interesting to look at, in a homogeneous forest where, say, there's only one species, it's like a plantation and they're only growing Douglas fir. How does water sharing differ compared to a forest that might be really diverse and have a mixture of species with kind of different needs and resource requirements, where water presumably might be being shared more effectively because of niche partitioning of needs. So that's another kind of area, is using stable isotopes to try to tease out kind of different plant water sources, which is really a really interesting field to be in. I find it quite fascinating.
One thing that occurs is the underbrush may have provided a gating mechanism. If there's heavy rains in an area of forest, perhaps, just by speculation, the underbrush would allow the water to infiltrate more slowly, even though it would take some of the water. But perhaps forest area may be more susceptible to flooding if it's not there, or is that wrong?
Yeah, it can definitely, if you have a really barren understory, there can definitely be more. If you have, a heavy rain, a lot more of that can just be lost to runoff and erosion, rather than if you have kind of an intact understory, say with a bunch of ferns and some shrubs. They have a shallower root system, which can kind of hold things in place better and might limit water loss to runoff.
Okay. I mean, what happens when underbrush is cleared? What does it look like before, during, and after, a rainstorm in a section of forest? What's noticed? Again, is there better infiltration, worse? What happens?
In the forest that I'm working on, where the treatments aren't targeting understory removal, it's more targeting overstory removal. So removing the trees, which have grown back really densely. So in a lot of these doghair thickets where these widespread restoration activities are happening, so for scale, a lot of these projects are 30-year projects that are trying to thin 70,000 acres. So they're really widespread across the landscape, and they're targeting the overstory. And so in a lot of these really dense forests, there's not a lot of understory plants because it's so choked out in the overstory. So there's no light reaching the forest floor because the overstory is so dense. And so the understory is pretty sad. So the idea is that if you go in and thin, you open up the overstory and a lot more light is coming through to the understory, which can help stimulate understory growth. So suddenly you might see this, you go in, you thin the forest, and 2 years later you come back and lo and behold, there's a bunch of grasses and ferns that have started to awaken from sort of dormant seeds in the soil profile. Does that make sense?
What do you mean? What do you mean awaken? What happens if are you looking at this longitudinally over weeks, months, years? What's observed at different stages once a clearing's been done?
Yeah, it probably takes like 1 or 2 years for the understory to sort of wake up. The timber operations are pretty hard on the landscape. I mean, there's different methods you can use, like cable yarding or having heavy equipment on the ground. So depending on, and I'm not an expert in forest operations, but depending on what methods were used for the logging, a lot of times there can be a lot of soil compaction and it can be kind of torn up in the process. So it can take maybe a year or two to start to see sort of the forest rebound after that. Just they call it thinning shock sometimes. It's just kind of, like aggressive on the forest to go in and take out almost half the trees. But within a year or two, you typically, because there's greater light hitting the forest floor, a lot of times in the soil, there can be seeds that have been in there dormant, like sleeping for a long time. And when they start getting enough sunlight and moisture, their dormancy will be broken. It's kind of like a required recipe to awaken the seed until conditions are going to be supportive of successful germination and establishment. And so post thinning, a lot of times you'll see this kind of reawakening or reinitiation of the understory. Additionally, once you've opened up the overstory via thinning, a lot of seeds will arrive at the location, on the wind or by birds or animals. So seeds are constantly kind of being moved around. And so you can have the understory sort of regenerate via seeds that were dormant in the seed bank. You can have the understory start to regenerate via seeds that are dispersed to this new real estate. And you can also have kind of regeneration happen called advanced regeneration, where there were some existing plants in the understory, but they were really sad and suppressed and just kind of like biding their time in the deep, dark shade of the understory, hoping for some sort of, gap in the canopy where they would start to get light. And once they get that light, they're ready to rock and roll because they already have an established root system and they're pretty much like all systems go. So that advanced regen is kind of another source of how the understory can kind of reawaken after one of these restoration thinning treatments. And the timeline is
I would think
about 2 years.
Yeah, I would think there's a lot more to this story. First of all, there would be a microenvironment created by the brush, at the bottom of the forest. Has anyone studied that? I can see seeds and things blowing in, but getting caught in the underbrush. So if you're clearing an area, is it better to clear, let's say, concentrically inwards, start on the outer edge of an area, clear it, wait a month, clear more, wait a month, clear, to allow these seeds and things maybe to get in deeper into the forest as you clear it. Maybe they're caught initially in the underbrush and then it gets cleared and they drop to the ground. And again, microenvironments created by the brush. The reason why I say it is that, I'm here in Austin, Texas, and we had like an ice storm and tons of limbs fell. And, the city stacked them up on the roads for like months. And all kinds of creatures were in there. And I wondered what, again, kind of microenvironments were created. And it got drier and drier and got close to being a fire hazard. So they finally cleared them. But that's why it comes to mind. Anyway, go ahead.
Yeah, usually like logistically, just kind of brass tacks with these operations. It's kind of you do like a single entry at first. So they come in, they, treat a stand, treat an area, and then they leave with the heavy equipment because it is sort of, hard on the land. And so you don't want to kind of like stagger it too much. It's like, go in, do your thing, and then get out and let the forest recover. So in their treatments with the project that I'm working on, Redwoods Rising is its name. It's a collaboration with Save the Redwoods League and then Redwood National and State Park. So it's a really big kind of team effort with lots of collaborators. And the treatments that the foresters are designing for that restoration project, we're using what we call variable density thinning. So it's kind of like making a patchwork mosaic of different densities in the forest. So you'll have gaps where they clear all the trees, and then you'll have skips where they don't clear any trees and they leave it really dense. And then you'll have areas where they've cleared 75% of the trees, areas where they've cleared 25% of the trees. So they kind of make it really heterogeneous in that is good for wildlife habitat. It's good for kind of a natural feel on the landscape. So that's the treatment that we're doing for this huge project. And as far as you're talking about like understory brush and the microclimate, yeah, a lot of people have studied kind of, forest regeneration has been a big topic of research, and understory reinitiation too. And they sometimes kind of shrubs, especially in places like the Sierra Nevada or something, where it can be really harsh and dry in the growing season. Here in the redwood forest, it's a very temperate climate. We're in a temperate rainforest, so the growing season is pretty benign and mild. But in harsher environments where that first and second growing season can be a make it or break it kind of situation for a lot of understory plants, the shrubs can act as like nurse shrubs. So underneath the shade and cover of, say, a manzanita bush or something like that, it might create a microclimate that's really conducive to the establishment of certain understory species or certain overstory species that can successfully germinate and establish in the nurse shrub environment or microclimate.
Yeah, I had thought that you just clear the underbrush and not the macro, trees themselves. Like, why clear the trees from an area too?
That's like the primary objective, because in the wake of clear-cut logging from, the 1800s and 1900s, where they just cut every single tree and left a completely blank canvas, what came back after that was just these dog hair thicket forests where you might have, it'd be hard for a deer to walk through the trees in the forest. They're really dense, and the understory is non-existent because there's no light and there's no diversity in terms of structure for wildlife habitat. The trees themselves are suppressed. They're in incredibly high levels of competition among all the stems that are in the forest. And it's also a lot of fuel for if fire did come through, it's like a standing matchbox, basically. So throughout much of the western United States, like west of the Rockies, a huge forestry objective is to thin the overstory, thin the trees, because they're too dense due to human activities. So due to logging practices, and in the interior west, due to grazing of cattle, because cattle eat grass and they don't like young conifers. And so when the cows eat grass is like the number one competitor for young trees that are establishing for water. And so if you've got a bunch of cows in there that don't like eating young conifer trees, but do like eating grass, the conifer young trees are really happy about that scenario because their number one competitor for water has just been munched. And so they have artificially high success, again, kind of due to human activities of grazing cattle. And so, the last 100+ years of human activities, fire suppression, grazing of cattle, logging, they've led to these really dense forests that are suppressed. They're like sitting ducks waiting for drought mortality, pests and pathogens, and wildfire.
So, all right. So I see why you're doing the heterogeneous, or you're trying to make a heterogeneous forest. I see why.
Yeah.
I see, to allow animals to move, to allow sunlight, to allow water, to allow just everything, certain things to grow. How did these forests do it naturally before they were clear cut, before they were messed up, by human activity? Like that speaks to an order of things appearing, things that were there to assist the appearance of, let's say very large trees that now, once they grew and they took over and changed the forest ecology so that other things could grow, what the natural way of doing it, has that been figured out? And what happens to make a sound forest instead of the mess that we have in certain forests there now?
Yeah. So before, European kind of colonization of the West, their, forests were in a much better balance. So one of the most impactful things that European settlers did was Smokey the Bear, suppress fire for 100+ years. And that had, we're still cleaning up that mess, because prior to fire suppression efforts, fire had been on the landscape for thousands of years in a high frequency, low intensity kind of a pattern. And much of this was done by indigenous people who inhabited the landscape and were stewards of the landscape and used fire as a management tool. And So for thousands of years, things were in a pretty good balance with that high frequency, low intensity fire and sort of the natural fire regime, which was, shepherded by indigenous stewards. And when you removed fire from the mix, you had a lot of fuel that then accumulated. So trees die, they fall to the ground, branches fall, pine cones fall, leaves fall. And without that high frequency, low intensity fire coming through really regularly, with the fire return interval being pretty quick, being pretty short, that allowed a lot of fuels to accumulate. It allowed forests to densify, to become much denser. And then, I've already kind of explained the the perfect storm of bad conditions that the forests are now enduring. So prior, I guess Smokey the Bear was kind of like the beginning of the end in terms of that natural balance for Western forests.
Well, I mean, have any forests been modified and cleared in such a way that now they do appear to be coming back in the right way? They're growing how they used to grow, and the forest accepts all comers now. It's a proper forest that all kinds of life can live there.
Yeah, there's tons of success stories. I think this is, sometimes I'm like, I don't know that we even need to study it anymore. Like, this works. I think it's been, shown, demonstrated again and again and again in a lot of different ecosystems, from the interior West to the, Redwood Coast. These types of like restoration forestry, it's really effective, and there can be smart ways to do it too, like reintroducing fire on the landscape with prescribed fires and figuring out, clever ways to do restoration treatments so that they pencil. A big challenge was, no one wants to go in. These restoration treatments can be really expensive to go in and thin these doghair thickets of basically like unmerchantable timber because all the trees are so small. And so it could be hard to fund. So you can kind of get creative about different ways of implementing these treatments so that you do maybe cut a few merchantable trees, and then that can foot the bill for the whole treatment. Or maybe get creative about selling carbon units that by thinning this forest, we're reducing the chances of catastrophic wildfire and the whole forest going up in smoke. And so we can get some carbon credits for that to try to fund it. Or, we'll use this wood for pellet stoves or something, finding merchantable outlets for otherwise unmerchantable timber. So there's been a lot of really creative thinking outside the box on those fronts. And I think that we have a lot of success stories of these types of forest restoration treatments across many different ecosystems in the U.S.
So it costs money, time, and effort. I guess it would be better if you went into an area maybe at least once a year, but then maybe it's even more expensive. But then again, is there a trade-off? If you leave an area of forest if you can only afford to go over there, let's say every 5 years, but it's very expensive to clear it versus going there every year, but maybe there's a lot less work to be done. Has that trade-off been evaluated? Is there a trade-off like that?
You wouldn't go back that frequently. Like maybe you could do repeat thinning treatments. Like I think every 10 years would be really fast. A lot of times, given how much landscape needs to be treated, the time between treatments can be quite long. So it would depend on kind of how productive the forest is, where you're working, and kind of what the ultimate like project goals were. If you're trying to increase heterogeneity or increase tree size, like kind of what the goals were, would have to be really carefully thought out about like what your treatment return time kind of scale should look like.
Well, has this been evaluated at all? Or, how often are they able to, again, there's all these areas of forest, with current budgeting, et cetera. How often are people able to go and clear an area? How long is it between cleanings, and how long should it be between cleanings? Has anyone evaluated that gap?
Yeah, I think a lot of people have studied different timelines of treatment, and I don't know that there's a single answer for like, it should be done every 15 years. It's really circumstantially dependent on what forest type you're working in. Like, are you working in pines? Or are you working in redwoods? Are you working in eastern hardwoods? Like it can be quite different, these ecosystems. And again, it depends kind of what your objective is for the forest. Like, are you trying to manage the forest for merchantable timber? Are you trying to manage the forest for wildlife habitat? Are you trying to manage the forest for recreational kind of aesthetics for people? So there's kind of different things that that you might be trying to achieve with the treatments, and that's going to have an influence on how often you return. So say like for commercial forestry on private timberlands in say redwood or Douglas fir, they're coming back like every 40 to 60 years to harvest the trees, and that's their rotation, and they've crunched the numbers, and that seems to work the best in that.
Oh, wow. That's a long time. I was thinking, 1, 3, or 5 years for a lot of the forests. For the redwoods, I understand they're enormous. They take long to grow, but is there a much shorter time frame for a lot of the forests that are not redwoods?
No, think of like forestry as part of agriculture, but you can think of it like it's not like a crop like corn, that's an annual crop. These crops are on, 40 to 60 year rotations. Like the trees grow slowly. And so if you want to, there's growth and yield models that, depending on species, depending on climate, depending on, site conditions, given this, depending on forest density, like how many trees per acre you have, this is how, when would be optimal to harvest your stand. So there's, computer modeling that can give you those answers.
Okay. I'm not sure what other factors. I mean, there's millions of factors in play. Is there any significant component of, fungi that are in and around the trees or in the brush, or again, anything that appears in the clearing that was a surprise? You mentioned seeds being quiescent, and now that they're exposed to sun and air and all that, now they start germinating and growing. Any other surprises in the clearings that's been discovered?
Let's think here. For the restoration treatments, I guess one thing that was surprising was that for redwood in particular, opening up the forest, like an unforeseen complication was that when you open up the forest and the residual trees, the trees that are left behind after you've taken out a bunch of them, those trees are now really happy about life, right? They've got way less competition. They've got lots of sun. They've got lots of water. Temperatures are nice. So they're really cranking in terms of photosynthesis and making sugars and growing. And the bears, the black bears, can kind of sniff that out. And so one complication that you have to kind of have on your radar in these restored forests is that the bears like to attack kind of the most vigorously growing trees, especially when they're young and the bark is maybe thinner. And they basically kill the tree because they'll eat the cambium layer, like the phloem tissue, which is just outside of it's part of like the inner bark of the tree, and it's where all the sugars are. And so the bears like that. Some people I've talked to who look at bear skulls are saying that, they've noticed that more and more bear skulls have a lot of tooth decay, and that's because they've been eating this like sugary tree phloem tissue. So that's been kind of something that was interesting and surprising over the past maybe 10 or 15, time is a blur, 20 years, where people have been noticing that the bears, and they think it's a learned behavior, that like the mother bear, it's not like an innate behavior, but that the mother bear teaches the cubs. And so you'll have kind of these populations of bears that are really into attacking redwood trees, much to the timber company's kind of horror.
Yeah, so I guess they could smell it inside the tree, even though the bark and everything is in place, and then they tear into the tree and eat the innards.
Yeah.
Huh.
Yeah.
Do they cause trees to fall down, or do they eat through the bark and cause them to dry out and die? Like what happens?
They generally, by doing that, will essentially girdle the tree. So they like eat all the phloem in a circle around the stem. And what that does is, if there's an entire ring of disrupted phloem, this tissue that carries the sugars in the tree, if they eat that all around, then basically the sugars that the leaves are producing can't get down to the root system of the tree. And so the roots eventually die. They starve. They need food. And they can't get the food because the phloem has been eaten. And so, the tree will die standing, and then it'll eventually get blown over in a windstorm, or some, neighbor tree will knock it over, or a bear might knock it over, different things like that.
Interesting. Okay. So what are some of the current projects that you're working on now? What things are you trying to investigate and solve?
Yeah, so I've been working on that Redwoods Rising restoration project, kind of looking at forest responses to those thinning treatments. And then another project that I just finished up working on was looking at how different trees in Northern California is incredibly botanically diverse. So we actually live in the most conifer diverse location on the planet. We have a ton of different conifer species. It's really, if you're into trees, like heaven to live here. And so we had a really big drought, 2012 through 2016. It was kind of like a record-breaking drought in this region, a multi-year, very severe drought. It caused widespread mortality all throughout the Sierra Nevada. And so I just finished up a study looking at how different trees responded to that drought kind of in this region. So it was well studied in the Sierras where they had 90% mortality in some stands because of drought. But up where we are on the north coast of California, the responses to the drought weren't so dire. And so I've been working on looking at Northern California tree responses to drought, which has been an interesting kind of avenue to go down.
Okay. Well, very good. Where can people find out more about your work? Maybe see some pictures or videos, things like that. What's a good resource for them?
Yeah, I have a website. I don't even know the address. I'll look it up right now. Let's see. If you Google my name, Lucy Kerhoulas, Humboldt, it comes up for the forestry faculty. And then I do have a website, Kerhoulas, KERHOULAS, forestlab.weebly.com is the website.
Okay. Well, very good. Well, Lucy, thanks so much for coming on the podcast. It's always more complicated than I first think, and I appreciate you fielding the questions and my armchair speculations. So thank you.
Oh, good. Thanks for taking the time to listen to some of the work I've been doing.
Thank you for listening to the Good Question Podcast. Please email support@thegoodquestionpodcast.com if you have any referrals to great guests for us to interview. Visit thegoodquestionpodcast.com to hear more interviews. And please help us spread the word by rating and reviewing us on Apple Podcasts, iTunes, Spotify, YouTube, or wherever you listen to this podcast.